After over a year of turbulence, Mali prepares for the return of a democratically elected president. First up, though, Kenyan lawmakers are due to debate pulling the country's membership of the International Criminal Court. Parliament scheduled an emergency sitting on the matter for Thursday. The move comes ahead of the Crimes Against Humanity trial next week of Vice President William Ruto. President Uhuru Kenyatta is also due in court in November. Both men are charged over post-electoral violence in 2007, but have said that they will cooperate with the ICC. Now, leaving the ICC would be a long process and not affect the upcoming trials. France 24 Duncan Woodside's in Nairobi. He tells us more.
The trial of William Ruto, the vice president, is due to start next week. And after that, the trial of Uhuru Kenyatta, the president of Kenya. Both of them, of course, were elected only a few months ago, back in March. Since then, the African Union has moved a motion back in late May saying that the International Criminal Court should respect the sovereignty of all nations, including Kenya in particular. And it's within that context we need to view the move by the Kenyan Parliament to effectively extricate the country from the obligations of the Rome Statute. The Rome Statute, of course, is the treaty, the international treaty, which applies to the application of the International Criminal Court's jurisdiction. Now, if Kenya were to extricate itself from the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, and if the two main accused, Uhuru Kenyatta and William Ruto, were to stop cooperating with the court, then in that context, at that point, the ICC would likely issue warrants for their arrest.
Khartoum and Juba agree that South Sudanese oil will continue to move through Sudanese pipelines for export. Sudan had threatened to stop transporting southern crude in retaliation for Juba's alleged backing of insurgents. But the shutdown's been avoided after the presidents of both countries met in Khartoum Tuesday to patch up their rocky relations.
It was only Salva Kiir's second visit to Khartoum since South Sudan's independence in 2011, and it was a fruitful one. Omar al-Bashir had threatened to stop oil shipments by Friday, but after the meeting, Khartoum said the South's oil will continue to move through Sudan for export on the Red Sea. A little earlier, South Sudan's new Minister of Petroleum said the two nations had to end their festering conflicts.
We can say there is 50-50 of win-win situation. There no somebody here is losing or is one actor who is victorious. We are not thinking in that way. So the flow of oil is not just a demand of one side. I think this is for the two parties and other stakeholders that oil should follow.
Before the meeting, Khartoum had accused Salva Kiir of backing the Sudan Revolutionary Front, an alliance of rebels from the regions of Darfur, South Kordofan and Blue Nile. South Sudan always denied supporting insurgents along the 2,000-kilometer border. Tuesday's announcement is good news for Juba. Crude exports is the major source of foreign revenue for the landlocked country. It produces around 200,000 barrels a day. South Sudan's oil fields are mainly operated by Chinese, Indian and Malaysian firms. But many tensions still remain over disputed border areas, especially Abyei. The African Union called for an October referendum on the region, but Khartoum rejects the suggested eligibility criteria for the vote.
The strike in South Africa's gold mines has begun this evening. Tuesday's stoppage was called by the country's main mining union after weeks of wage negotiations with management broke down last week. The NUM union wants a pay rise of 60% for workers, but the gold mining sector's on the decline. Bosses say that they're facing rising costs in the extraction, of the precious metal. Now, the strikes are the latest in a wave of walkouts in the auto and building sectors that have weighed heavily on the South African economy. Dr. Paul Simon Handy is from Pretoria's Institute for Security Studies. He tells us more about workers' claims that they receive apartheid-era pay packets.
The wages are relatively low, and the living conditions of the mine workers are not good at all. So there's a lot to do and to improve in that respect. But of course, it's certainly a rhetoric hit-up to say that these are apartheid conditions. I think it's a bit exaggerated, but the conditions of mine workers are certainly not the best.
Now, aren't these strikes pretty much an annual affair in South Africa? But this time around, see that President Jacob Zuma is particularly concerned about the impact that they're going to have on the economy.
Yeah, that's true. It's what they generally call in South Africa, what we refer to here as a strike season. President Zuma is particularly concerned, first because of the precedent of last year, the killings in Marikana, around also a strike that went wrong. But President Zuma is particularly concerned also in view of the legislative elections next year, which are supposed to see him become winning these elections and running for a second term. But President Zuma is not worried about his result. He knows he'll probably win. He will be the next president. But the turmoil in the union sector might actually jeopardize a huge majority of the ANC, and might see President Zuma win with something like 50% majority, which will be a huge blow for the ANC and personally for President Zuma.
On the eve of his exit as Mali's interim president, Diokonda Traoré headed out to Ivory Coast for his last overseas visit before leaving office. Ivorian troops contributed to an African force that was part of the French-led military intervention that turned around an Islamist invasion in northern Mali earlier this year. Traoré thanked Ivory Coast leader Alassane Ouattara before returning to Bamako, where his successor, Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta, is due to be sworn in on Wednesday. Now, Mali is hoping national reconciliation will help move the country on from over a year of social and political turbulence. But in the capital, our reporters say that the most pressing concern of people there is getting help with the aftermath of last week's fatal flash floods.
The mayor's office at the Bankoni district in the Malian capital, Bamako, still dripping from the floodwaters that gushed through its windows. Only a handful of documents could be saved by staff who days later are still traumatized. The waters rose up to 2 meters high.
We had to try and climb up on top of the doors. We had no choice, otherwise we would drown in the water.
Mali sees annual floods but has rarely seen such destruction, a result experts say that isn't just due to heavy rains.
The state of the soil and the draining of the water all need to be taken into account. There were heavy rains, but it's a mix of everything that led to the floods.
Mud and stumps of mortar are all that are left of Moussa's home and hairdressing salon, a business he thought was solid.
My house was built with mud brick that were covered with cement. It was covered with a coat of cement on the inside and out, so we thought that we were safe here. But for me, the country's leaders have failed. It's their fault. The gutters are blocked, they're filled with waste, so water can't get through them.
Rebuilding won't be easy in the numerous neighbourhoods across the capital that were literally washed away in the floods. A sizable task therefore awaits the next government, one locals want them to take on quickly.
France 24's Yves Irvine there. Now, secular leaders in Tunisia say they're worried that the Islamist-led government is tightening its grip on press freedoms. On Tuesday, journalists protested in Tunis, accusing officials of hand-picking candidates for public media bodies. Nick Baker has more.
At Tunisia's state radio, today's opening jingle is one of protests. Dozens of journalists rallied outside their office Tuesday, demonstrating against the appointment of a pro-government team to head up both the country's public radio and the media regulations body.
The Tunisian public radio is biased towards the government and ruling party. We ask for a new and balanced leadership so that we can cover the election with a public service that keeps all sides equal.
The move comes weeks before the Transitional Assembly is due to complete a draft constitution and a new election law. Many fear that the Tunisian media risks falling back into the heavy censorship that was applied during the era of former President Ben Ali.
Today, the public radio has been enslaved by the government through direct appointments, which are dodgy and are not based on efficiency and skills.
Worries about media freedom are rising in Tunisia as the country remains locked in a political standoff between an Islamist-led government and secular parties that want to make sure their voices will be heard.
That's what wraps up Africa News from me for now, but I will be back with more tomorrow, Molly.
All right, Georgia, thank you very much
Thanks a lot
for that. And do stay with us. We'll have the latest on the U.S. Senate hearing on the intervention in Syria. That hearing still going on in Washington. And we'll also have a sports update. Dan Levy will be here with a roundup of football's transfer action that's coming up. And live from Paris, do stay with us.